Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. For the last few Authority File series, I've been telling you all about our new podcast called Patron Driven. It's coming up in late June, and we're really excited for you to hear it. It's going to be much different than the Authority File. It's a lot like the narrative-style podcasts many of you have probably listened to. It's much more story-driven. Season 1 is a 5-part series that follows 4 librarians through the destruction of the Lone Star College Kingwood Library after Hurricane Harvey, the 2 years it took to rebuild, and the new space, services, and relationships that emerged from it all. Lone Star College is a community college out in Texas. It's such a great story. It's got drama, grit, perseverance, and it's a terrific library success story. Patron Driven debuts in late June wherever you get your podcasts. You can visit our website, choice360.org, to learn more about it. Click on the librarianship drop-down to find the Patron Driven landing page where you can access more info and sign up for email updates. While you're there, you'll find behind-the-scenes bonus content for the new program, and you can check out the new trailer for the upcoming series. Okay, so back to the Authority File. We've got another great set of episodes on deck, and my guest for this series is Sarah Todd, who, along with Sebastian Savard, co-edited the book Canadian Perspectives on Community Development, published by University of Ottawa Press. Through its contributed pieces, the book takes an incredibly thorough look at how community work is practiced in Canada. As you can imagine, community work in Canada, but anywhere really, is complex, which gives rise to a diverse set of practices that makes it difficult to think of a quote-unquote Canadian approach to social work. This is what Sarah and Sebastian address in their book, looking for the through lines in that complexity of community development, particularly in forging new pathways of communication between Anglophone and Francophone communities. This is episode 3, brought to you by the University of Ottawa Press, and Sarah and I talk about how the relationship between the state and local service providers is impacting the practice of community work. Okay, so talk about the push and pull between individual communities and the state impact on programs and services. I mean, it sounds like there's been an effort to, in some areas, push programs and services to the community level, but there's also still quite a bit of control at the state level. And I think also in this question is the idea that the state can be very rigid in its approach to community work, whereas one would think that at the community level it's much more flexible and accepting of differences and changes, and where a certain kind of rigidity may be counterproductive to community work. And I'm wondering if you could sort of, to the extent that you can, characterize or explain how that push and pull between the community level and the state level pans out or works in sort of the real world.
Yeah, that's a helpful question, because I think oftentimes that perception as the state being rigid and inflexible and sort of heavy is sometimes how I think about it. And then the community being quite agile and flexible and open is one dynamic that plays out. At the same time, in the book and in reality, I think sometimes it is the community that is rigid, the community that has really fixed boundaries and closed down, and it's having trouble opening up and seeing possibilities. And it is state actors who are coming in and saying, you need to think about new ways of working and imagining yourselves and open up the boundaries. So it's a bit like a dance, and certainly the power differential that I think your question sort of highlights is one we note in the book, where the state is the one that sets the music and is the lead, and the community is kind of trying to adapt and play around that. But sometimes the community also needs a bit of support and guidance. So that push-pull has really different impacts depending on the context. And at one level, the devolution of responsibility from the state to the community has been problematic, and the state maintains control, and that has really diminished the possibilities for communities. And at some other levels and contexts, you see the state's intervention in communities really putting some capacity in there for creative opportunity. So I think, and I think sometimes in this text, you can see that difference around linguistic communities, that for Francophone communities, particularly in Quebec, the state has been very effective in supporting community organizing and putting resources at the grassroots level. So there's a more demand made on the state, and that's seen as a responsibility of the state to its citizens. Where I think in other regional contexts, you see that downloading of this from the state being more problematic for communities. So it is a dance, and it continually, it's always continuing and evolving.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay. Given the complexity of community work in Canada and really anywhere, talk about how you curated the contributions in your volume with Sebastian, and how did you select the works to be included, and what was the process for organizing them within the text?
Right. So I when we initially sketched out the book, it was an interesting exercise because we wanted a lot of regional diversity. So, Canada is a very large country, just geographically, and that means there's lots of regional diversity. So we wanted uh, representatives from all the regions, both coasts of the country, from more northern contexts and southern contexts, um, and within that, we also wanted uh, various identity communities highlighted. So it was really trying to look at age, both people who are older, and to look at youth, to look at Indigenous people, to understand immigrants and refugees, to take up poverty, to understand queer communities, to get a really diverse snapshot, to take up disability. So we were trying to take a real intersectional approach to both geography, language, and identity, and to create as much theoretical diversity and as much interdisciplinary conversation as we could. Then the challenge was we had all this
Yeah.
and how to sort of line it up against and put pieces in conversation with each other. Um, and so the text starts with an Indigenous perspective and then sort of moves into different communities and back and forth across the country, sometimes setting two different experiences with a community or with a linguistic group or region beside each other to show that there's very different approaches to that work. And sometimes then putting two very different works about two different communities and beside each other to show, to hopefully help the reader see that there's continuity between, or lessons to bring from one community into the other.
Mm-hmm. As you were assembling the or collecting the chapters, were you sharing them around with other contributors so they could see what other authors were writing and working on, so they may be able, as you say, to sort of allow that or facilitate that ability for one chapter to respond to another? Or were you just looking for, as you received these contributions, were you just looking for commonalities or um, not overlap necessarily, but areas where a couple of chapters might fit well together, so you would naturally put them next to each other?
Um, yeah, so we the chapters went out for review, and we tried to make sure that we got reviewers um, who had different perspectives on either the community or the region that the chapter was addressing. And then we often had conversations between groups of authors about saying, there's another chapter in your region that's taking up this topic or that's working with this community in a different way, and connected those authors to each other, and or sometimes showed the chapters back and forth. It really depended a little bit on, we took different approaches with different chapters. This book was a long process, years in the making. So that time gave us opportunities to really share contributions with each other.
Okay. Oh, wow. So how many years did it take to pull this together?
It took 5 years.
Oh,
So
wow.
it was
Okay.
a labor of love. Yeah.
Absolutely. You just heard from Sarah Todd. Sarah is professor and director of the School of Social Work at Carleton University in Ottawa. She is also a 3M teaching fellow. She is the co-editor of Canadian Perspectives on Community Development, along with Sebastian Savard, who is full professor and interim director of the School of Social Work at the University of Ottawa. Canadian Perspectives on Community Development is published by the University of Ottawa Press. This episode is brought to you by the University of Ottawa Press. Join us next week for our final episode of this series when we continue our conversation by discussing the ways in which the book reimagines community work and what the future holds for the practice.
Bill Lee and his group, who take up a focus on trauma in many marginalized communities. They focused on queer communities and Indigenous communities and refugee communities, and really ask community workers to think about trauma not as a weakness, but as an important impact. It impacts how people function and connect with each other, and thus community work needs to involve recovery and healing. In order to get to social justice, it's not just about your technique and your analysis, but it's, when we're dealing with trauma, it's about humility and patience and compassion and recognition.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice, and if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.